Hi, welcome back to the channel. My name is Jay, and I'm a naval historian and historian in general, and I like talking about the past. And for the next 9 weeks, I got a bit of a treat for all of you, in which the next 8 weeks I will be reading out a section from my master's thesis, and then on week 9 I'm going to give you a bit of update and fill out some more stuff that I found out since I finished my master's thesis 5 years ago. So with that, I should let you know that it actually works out that because my master's thesis had 6 main body chapters as well as the introduction and conclusion. So this week on week 1, I'm going to be giving you guys the introduction. The thesis was entitled The Submarine and Maritime Strategy, an examination of the role in which the submarine filled in early 20th century maritime strategy. And this was completed back in July of 2020 during the middle of the pandemic. I'm actually grateful that where I was working while I still had to go into the office, we were pretty much done every day by 2:30 with everything we had to do. And so I would spend a few hours also working on this. So anyway, this is the introduction, and here we go. The introduction of submarines into the world's navies was an intentional policy decision that was made by the maritime forces of Great Britain, Germany, and the United States, which augmented their fleets and allowed for an additional weapons platform to accomplish their strategic goals. With the anglo-german naval arms race and the expansion of the American Navy under the influence of Alfred Thayer Mahan and the guidance of Theodore Roosevelt, these maritime forces would need to construct vast fleets to protect their nation's interests and defend their homelands. The submarine, while being a new technology, would become a key tool in achieving the maritime goals of Great Britain, Germany, and the United States, and would demonstrate its full potential during the early days of the First World War. By taking on roles such as coastal defense, scouting, and eventually commerce raiding, the submarine provided a tool that allowed for the capital ships to concentrate into a single battle fleet. Therefore, the submarine's abilities to fulfill multiple mundane but necessary tasks made it a valuable tool for each navy that acquired them. Every nation has an overarching strategic maritime objective in which each ship type had a role in achieving that goal. Therefore, guiding the decision to incorporate submarines into their fleets. For Great Britain, it was the defense of the global empire it had assembled during the Age of Sail, along with defending the British Isles from an invasion by a rival continental European power. During the years leading up to the First World War, the Royal Navy, under the guidance of Admiral Sir John Arbuthnot Jackie Fisher, would develop the submarine to be used alongside a destroyer as a first line of defense to protect the home islands from an invasion. Imperial Germany had recently been unified under Kaiser Wilhelm I, with Otto von Bismarck at the helm as Chancellor. For centuries, Germany had been a collection of independent principalities and duchies. Therefore, it had not participated in the colonial conquests that other European powers had been pursuing since the beginning of the 16th century. The Imperial German Navy was expanded under Kaiser Wilhelm II and Admiral Alfred von Tirpitz to challenge their European rivals, expanded their fledgling colonial territory, and impress upon the rest of the world that Germany was more than a continental power. The U-boats, while introduced into the fleet later than their counterparts in the Royal Navy, were intended to be the offensive vanguard of the Imperial German Navy. Tasked with sweeping the ocean in front of the high seas fleet, the U-boats would scout for the enemy fleet and attempt to cripple as many capital ships as it could, thereby evening the odds for Germany during a surface engagement. The United States was emerging as a world power during the decades leading up to the First World War. The victory over Spain in 1898 resulted in the United States gaining a small empire which needed defense, and demonstrated to most of Europe that the U.S. Navy could be a serious maritime challenger. However, it was not the empire building that was at the heart of American foreign policy. Instead, it was projecting its power to enforce the Monroe Doctrine and the open door policy. The U.S. Navy was the first to adopt the Holland submarine, with the intention of using these vessels to defend the coast from an invasion, thereby allowing the larger battleships and cruisers to be deployed to Latin America and the Western Pacific to enforce American policy. The exploits of submarines, particularly German U-boats, have been well documented and commented on since the First World War. The menace that was lurking just beneath the surface of the ocean had long fascinated the popular imagination. What had been an experimental vessel and the central feature of Jules Verne's classic 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea had developed into a legitimate threat to maritime shipping within 50 years of the publication of that great work of fiction. However, despite this interest, little attention had been focused on how the submarine was developed in the latter days of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century. Likewise, there's a noticeable lack of reporting and analysis on the adaptation of the submarine into the major navies of the world in the years leading up to the First World War. As time would show, submarines would become a primary offensive weapon for navies to use as the 20th century progressed. Their development occurred during the same era as dreadnoughts and battlecruisers, yet the submarine has either been overlooked in favor of a focus on those capital ships or briefly commented on. Dreadnoughts and battlecruisers have long excited public interest for several reasons, namely the capital investment that the Navy had placed in each vessel, the massive firepower from their main guns, and the legacy of the great ship versus ship battles of the Age of Sail. However, the days of the battle fleets facing one another in surface engagement were numbered coming into the 20th century. The future of sea combat would move to vessels that can maneuver beneath the surface and stealthily stalk its prey. While the submarine would eventually become the subsurface menace that the German U-boats would represent during both of the World Wars, it would start the 20th century as a developing technology. During this era, the navies of the world were beginning to employ new technology into their fleets and ships that aided in accomplishing their maritime goals, especially wireless telegraphs, self-propelled and guided torpedoes, and submarines. When first introduced into most navies, the submarine was tasked with filling the coastal defense role, which allowed for battleships to focus on fighting other battleships, not protecting the coast of the homeland. Furthermore, submarines during the early years of the 20th century had the potential to conduct commerce raiding missions, filling the Corps de Guerre role that in past naval wars was assigned to independently cruising surface ships such as brigs, schooners, and frigates, and was an intended task for modern steam cruisers. With this in mind, submarine development should be viewed as a key aspect of pre-World War I naval planning. The decisive fleet engagement between armadas of battleships was still central to all maritime doctrines during this era, and the introduction of submarines supported this concept. Submarines would be employed as scouts, attacking vanguard forces, and for coastal defense. This would free cruisers from those tasks and allow these ships to be deployed as escorts in the main battle fleet. Submarines also free cruisers and battleships from the peacetime coastal defense of the homeland, allowing the ships to patrol the colonies, maintain freedom of passage in the sea lanes, and project their nation's power abroad. During this era, the majority of naval planners and thinkers, including Alfred Thayer Mahan and Julian Corbett, held firm to the ideal that victory in a decisive battle like Trafalgar was the main goal of any navy. The battleships, when concentrated into a single battle fleet, were the key instrument in achieving naval superiority and eventually supremacy. Smaller ships were viewed as vessels needed to perform the routine, mundane, yet still crucial tasks of maritime patrols, fleet or convoy escort, or protection of the homeland or a nation's territorial possessions. In this regard, they viewed smaller ships such as submarines as a defensive option which would allow battleships to concentrate into a single battle fleet. Therefore, colonial patrols and later powered projection were seen as secondary tasks that battleships and cruisers could perform during peacetime. The main focus of navies during this era was on preparing for the decisive maritime battle in the next war. This mindset held sway through most of the first half of the 20th century and only was challenged during the years following Pearl Harbor. For this project, the Royal Navy, Imperial German Navy, and the U.S. Navy were chosen because of the different approaches to adopting the submarine into service. Each nation had differing strategic goals that it required its navy to fulfill, and each nation approached maritime strategy from a unique angle that reflected its priorities. Maritime strategy had never been focused solely on naval supremacy, in contrast to the works of Mahan and Corbett, and the thinking of many naval officers, especially during the early years of the 20th century. Any maritime strategy of a nation is centered upon the foreign policies pursued by the government of that state. Indeed, as the 20th century unfolded, it has been national policies and goals that have guided military strategy, not the application of the theory of the warfare. Submarines were not introduced into the Royal Navy, Imperial German Navy, or the U.S. Navy because they represented a new development in naval warfighting capability, but because these vessels served a role in fulfilling those nations' strategic goals as defined by its foreign policy. The three nations in this study had maritime priorities based on its strategic goals, whether it was maintaining its status as the global naval hegemon with Great Britain, fulfilling the monarch's desire to have a navy to present to the rest of the world that his empire should be respected globally with Germany, or finally having the capability to enforce doctrines to keep Europe from interfering in the affairs of the Western Hemisphere and encourage open international trade in China with the United States. As the naval hegemon for the entirety of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century with a fleet larger than the next two combined, the Royal Navy is rightfully the most studied navy from this era. As the dominant maritime force during the early years of the 20th century, the Royal Navy served as the model for the rest of the world's navies to follow. Any new development or technology that Great Britain put to sea was quickly adopted by the rest of the world. The all-large gun dreadnought is a classic example of the Royal Navy leading the rest of the world in naval developments. However, the Royal Navy at the end of the Victorian era was overstretched, quickly aging due to the large number of obsolete ships, and in need of an institutional shakeup. The century of dominance after Trafalgar led to stagnation in naval thinking in the British Admiralty at Whitehall in London. Despite being a leader in developing the submarine during the latter half of the 20th century, these vessels were seen as an underhanded weapon by traditionalists in the Royal Navy. Instead, the focus of the Admiralty was on constructing battleships that would ensure Great Britain's naval supremacy and protect all their territory. In contrast to the majority of Royal Navy flag officers, Fisher saw the future potential of his submarines, and as First Sea Lord attempted to shift the Royal Navy's defensive duties from cruisers and battleships to submarines. Battleships, as far as Fisher was concerned, were on their way to obsolescence, despite the focus of maritime strategy on decisive fleet battles. Submarines, with their stealthy characteristics and ability to ambush its prey, were the better weapon to protect the British Isles. Fisher reckoned that the knowledge that an invasion fleet would have to sail through the North Sea or English Channel that was patrolled by these underwater vessels would be enough of a deterrent to render the threat of an enemy attack on the British Isles futile. However, this concept was met with resistance from other officers in the Royal Navy who believed that the battleship would remain the key vessel to maintain naval supremacy long into the future. It is possible, and very likely, that the resistance that Fisher faced in his efforts to shift the submarine was due to the ideal being at least half a century ahead of where the rest of the naval community was at conceptually during the early 20th century. Most naval thinkers and officers still believed future fleet engagements would be steel versions of Nelson's battles. The U.S. Navy's victory at Manila could be seen as the armored and steam-powered version of Copenhagen. Similarly, the American route of the Spanish fleet at Santiago, Cuba, had similarities to the Royal Navy's flushing out and defeat of the USS Essex in Valparaiso in 1814. Finally, the defeat of the Russian fleet by the Japanese Navy at Tsushima in 1905 reinforced the traditional viewpoint. The Imperial German Navy was a long neglected regional fleet, with the vaunted Prussian-led army being the center of military life in that nation. However, after the ascent of Kaiser Wilhelm II to the throne, the Navy began to receive the funding it needed to modernize and expand. This expansion received an adrenaline boost after 1897 when Tirpitz was named State Secretary of the Naval Office, placing him in charge of naval planning and construction for the Reich. Under his leadership, the Imperial German Navy quickly grew in size, with Tirpitz focusing the efforts of ship construction and fleet composition on challenging the Royal Navy. The Imperial German Navy was built to focus on offensive naval deployment. Tirpitz was a firm believer in the adage that offense made for the best defense. This meant that submarines needed to be constructed for offensive usage, not coastal defense, which most navies choose to use the vessels for during this era. The plan to use U-boats to offset the surface fleet disparity that Germany faced in a potential fleet conflict with the Royal Navy. By deploying U-boats as a stealthy vanguard of the high seas fleet, the plan sought to use these vessels to thin out the enemy force before it reached the main battle fleet. While the older concept of Corps de Guerre was not considered as a strategy but would be used by the high seas fleet, U-boats were well suited for that task. Because of Tirpitz insisted that the Imperial German Navy be an offensive force, resulted in U-boat crews receiving thorough training in regards to tracking and sinking surface ships. This training meant that when the German naval war effort shifted to submarine warfare, the U-boat crews are already prepared to stalk and sink any ship that it came across. It was not the number of U-boats in 1914 and 1915 that caused the global shock of the realities of modern submarine warfare, but the training that the German sailors on board those vessels had undergone to make these submarines deadly efficient. Despite the proud fighting tradition that was established during its actions in the American Revolution and the War of 1812, the U.S. Navy had been neglected in the years following the Civil War. As the 20th century was dawning, and with the urging of navalists, including Theodore Roosevelt, with guidance provided by Mahan, and basking in the success of his commanding victory over Spain in 1898, the U.S. Navy had positioned itself as an emerging naval power. With the emergence of a strong modern navy, the United States would no longer play a secondary role in the foreign affairs in the Americas and involving China. One characteristic of early 20th century naval policy in regards to the U.S. Navy that tends to be overlooked by casual observers is how the geography of the United States mainland and the acquisition of Pacific territories provided the need for a large maritime force to protect America. It was especially crucial for the U.S. Navy to have numerous ships available to protect its far-flung assets in the days before Isthmian Canal was constructed. The Panama Canal would not be completed until 1914, which resulted in the U.S. Navy undergoing an expansion program to ensure that the fleet had an adequate number of ships to cover all of its assigned tasks, including the protection of both American coasts and the Pacific territories. Beginning with the McKinley administration and expanded under Roosevelt, the enforcement of the Monroe Doctrine in the Western Hemisphere and the open door policy in regards to China became central to U.S. Navy deployment and planning. In this regard, the U.S. Navy can be seen as the first Navy to shift its primary focus from colonial patrols to power projection with the intent of enforcing American national policy. While generally viewed as a Cold War development, the roots of American power projection can be seen in naval planning and operations during the early years of the 20th century and in the works of Mahan. An examination of pre-First World War submarine development shows that there were at least three unique approaches to maritime strategy. The Imperial German Navy planned exclusive for a decisive battle to be fought against the Royal Navy, therefore assigning their U-boats for offensive patrols and training their crews accordingly. While the U.S. Navy planned for a decisive battle, the United States would use its fleet for power projection missions during peacetime, such as the voyage of the Great White Fleet. Submarines were intended to protect the American homeland and key territorial positions, allowing for the deployment of battleships and cruisers onto missions that promoted national interest. Finally, the Royal Navy under Fisher was in the process of rejecting the maritime tradition of planning exclusively for a fleet engagement involving battleships. Instead, it was shifting to a new version of naval warfare centered on smaller vessels such as the submarine, fulfilling the tasks that battleships and cruisers had traditionally held. New section, questions under consideration. To address the question of why Great Britain, Germany, and the United States made the decision to invest in submarines before they were tested by combat on the high seas, the first question that needs to be addressed is what it was the strategic backgrounds of each nation's maritime service. The research for this project has found that each of these navies were focused on achieving a unique maritime goal and would influence the introduction of submarines into their fleets. The Royal Navy had been the dominant maritime force on the world's oceans since Nelson's victory at Trafalgar in 1805, and had to maintain that supremacy while also defending the home islands from invasion. Kaiser Wilhelm II sought to build a navy to rival the British, with Tirpitz tasked to develop the fleet and equipped it with the ability to challenge the Royal Navy. Lastly, the United States was emerging as a major power on the world stage and required a modern navy to project its newfound power onto oceans. Once the strategic background is established, then the question shifts to ascertaining the proposed purpose of the submarine in each navy's war planning. First, the historiography is filled with studies of Royal Navy policy and plans during the early years of the 20th century during the past century, especially in regards to the initial tenure of Fisher as First Sea Lord between 1904 and 1910. It was on his watch that the Royal Navy made a technological leap to the all-big gun battleships with the construction of HMS Dreadnought and introduced the world to the concept of the battlecruiser with HMS Invincible. Fisher was also attempting to introduce a new strategy for the maritime protection of the British Isles with the concept of flotilla defense. Unlike the Royal Navy, it has been more difficult to locate direct missions of the submarine's role in pre-World War I naval planning in Germany and the United States. However, Tirpitz did choose to invest in submarines in the Novelle of 1908 and continue to increase funding for submarines as years progress. His delay in the initial investment has been traditionally argued that Tirpitz was focused on building battleships. However, there is evidence to show that he was waiting for the technology to develop that would maximize the offensive potential of the submarine. As for the U.S. Navy, the efforts of the Roosevelt administration in modernizing and expanding the fleet, America's unique geographic position, and their foreign policy objectives made it required for every class of warship to be placed into commission to fulfill all the tasks they were assigned, including submarine. Finally, it is necessary to ask if the leading admirals correctly projected a course of future naval combat, especially the actions of Fisher and Tirpitz. Unlike the United States, where defensive policies and priorities change with the opening of each new Congress and the transition of presidential power every 4 to 8 years, the British Admiralty and the German State Secretary for the Imperial Naval Office had more flexibility to enact long-term naval plans as they saw fit. With that in mind, were Fisher and Tirpitz able to construct the appropriate naval weapons for high seas combat in the 20th century? The immediate results from the First World War show that both admirals had mixed results. There were ships that they championed that would not perform as promised in combat, and construction expenditures that would result in a better than expected return on investment. And that is the end of the introduction. I hope you enjoyed it. I'll be back next week with Chapter 1 discussing the historiography of this era. And with that said, I hope you like this. Please like, subscribe, and share. If you're going to comment, please be kind to everyone. And I will see you next time.